today. My name is Krista. I work in the Local History and Genealogy Department at the Kenton County Public Library. And today we are at the Mary E. Smith Memorial Cemetery in Elsmere, Kentucky. And we're filming our virtual tour. So a little bit about the cemetery, just to get us started. The Mary E. Smith Memorial Cemetery was founded in 1950 and named in honor of Reverend Edward Smith's mother, Mary E. Smith. Mary E. Smith was born in 1866 in Union Springs, Alabama, to Harry and Emily Howard. The small rural community of Union Springs is located in southeast Alabama, and prior to the Civil War, the American Civil War, their main agricultural export was cotton. Harry and Emily Howard were farm laborers, and although we can't find them in early census records, it's likely that they worked in the cotton fields. At the age of 14 in 1880, Mary Howard married Shepherd Smith. They made their home on a farm in Greenwood, which is just 15 minutes west of Union Springs. Mary and Shepherd had the following children that we know of. They had Jim, Edward, Price, and May Ida. Most of the family moved to Birmingham around 1915, and according to the city directory for 1914, Birmingham was widely known as the city of payrolls and as the geographical center of the progressive New South. Mary and Shepherd lived with their son Price, his wife Annie, and their grandchildren Mary Ida, Alberta, Mary, and Shepherd's daughter May Ida Smith. Shepherd and Price worked as laborers in the nearby industries. Shepherd Smith died in 1926, and he's buried in a small Mason City African-American cemetery in Birmingham, Alabama. After the death of her husband, Mary continued to live with her son, Price Smith, and his growing family. By 1940, 4 generations were living in a single household in Birmingham. After the death of her son, Price, in 1935, and the death of her daughter, May Ida, in 1944, Mary went to live with her son Edward and his family in Covington, Kentucky. She died on May 19, 1950 at the age of 84, and she was the first person to be buried here in Mary E. Smith Memorial Cemetery. Mary E. Smith's son, Edward Smith, took a job on the C&O Railroad and moved with his wife, Desi, and daughter Marie from Alabama to Covington. Edward Smith and his family attended the First Baptist Church of Elsmere, Kentucky, where Edward served as the pastor for 29 years. He was involved in a number of community organizations, including the Kenton Lodge Number 16 of the Free and Accepted Masons, and served as the Grand Chaplain of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Kentucky. He was also a member of the First Baptist Church of Covington. His wife, Desi, was also very active in the church. Desi and Edward were foster parents to a number of children in the area. Desi died in 1977. Edward Smith died 11 years later in 1988 at the age of 98 at the home of his great-nephew, Dr. Herbert C. Smitherman. So Marie Smith, their daughter, Desi and Edward's daughter, married David Pettis in 1940 at the First Baptist Church of Covington. They were married by F.O. Locust. David Pettis was employed as a steel mill worker, and he died in 1986. Mary died in 1995. Her remains have not yet been interred in the cemetery. So this is the stone of the Delaney family. So we have John W. Delaney Sr., Elizabeth B. Delaney, and their son, John W. Delaney, and his wife, Laura. So starting with Elizabeth B. Young, as she was born on September 13th, 1882 in Fayette County, Kentucky. She was orphaned at a young age and raised by her grandmother. According to her bio in the Encyclopedia of Northern Kentucky, she was raised to value self-reliance, community service, and education. She attended Berea College in Kentucky and completed a full course of studies there. On April 28, 1898, she married John W. Delaney. At the time he was a junior. He lived in Garrett County, Kentucky. He worked as a seed inspector at a local company. The couple welcomed their first and only child, John W., so the junior, on September 5th, 1912. They lived in Covington and Latonia at a couple different places, and eventually ended up settling and purchasing a home in Covington at 30 West 15th Street. Several years later, in 1919, Elizabeth obtained her mortician's license and began working a funeral home business out of their home. Several years later, John died in 1927 on April 8th and was originally buried at Linden Grove Cemetery in Covington. He has since been reinterred here at Mary E. Smith. His wife, Elizabeth, naturally served as the undertaker for him. When he died in 1927, she was listed as the funeral director on his death certificate. She took over the business as the sole owner and operator and continued to operate that funeral home business for 40 years. She renamed it to the E. B. Delaney and Son Funeral Home, and they added a second location in Cincinnati, which was located at 431 West 7th Street. By the time the 1940 census was taken, their son, John W., was working as her assistant, so an assistant funeral director. The census indicates that Elizabeth had attended 2 years of college and her son had attended 5 years of college. Elizabeth was very active in her community and served in a number of roles in various organizations. She served on the board of directors of the National Negro Business League. She was a member of the National Association of Black Funeral Home Directors. She attended the First Baptist Church in Covington and served as their treasurer for 12 years, among other roles that she served. She was elected the 11th president of the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs in Kentucky and served as the president of the Ladies Improvement Club in Covington. Elizabeth was the first African-American chairwoman of the Colored Women Voters of Kenton County. She was a member of the Kentucky Commission on Interracial Cooperation and attended the first Southern Women and Race Cooperation Conference in Memphis, Tennessee in 1920. Elizabeth played a part in establishing several chapters of the Order of Eastern Star, of which she was also an active member. In 1963, a year before her death, her Cincinnati funeral home was valued at $17,500, according to an article in the Cincinnati Enquirer. That was determined by a jury because apparently the city of Cincinnati wanted to redevelop the building that the land that her building was sitting on. And so they needed to value it. In 1988, she was added to the Black Hall of Fame, along with Dr. James E. Randolph, who's also buried here at the cemetery. And at that time, in 1988, her funeral home was still in operation. So jumping now to her son, John W. He was born again on September 5th, 1912. He was known as Jack, that was his nickname. He was a judge, businessman, and again, the only child of John W. and Elizabeth Delaney. As a child, he attended the Lincoln Grant School in Covington, and in 1929, he graduated from William Grant High School. In addition to assisting his mother in the funeral home business, he earned a bachelor's degree at the University of Cincinnati. He attended and graduated from the Salmon P. Chase College of Law in Cincinnati, the Cincinnati College of Embalming, the Cincinnati Cosmopolitan School of Music. So he was a very well-educated man. He served as Kenton County Deputy Judge Executive, the county's second highest-ranking official. Jack wrote the Articles of Incorporation of the Northern Kentucky Community Council, which later became the Northern Kentucky Community Center. He worked with the Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church and the St. James AME Church in Covington to develop the Geisler Garden Apartments, which were intended for low-income individuals. Jack was a historian of his Masonic Lodge and a 33rd degree Mason. He was a Grand Master of Prince Hall Masonic Lodge, served as the president of the National Funeral Directors and Morticians Association, and was the Eastern Vice President of the Epsilon Nu Delta Mortuary Fraternity. He was also a member of the Northern Kentucky Funeral Home Directors Association and the National Funeral Directors Association. Like his mother, he attended the First Baptist Church in Covington and served on the Board of Trustees as their treasurer. He also served as an organist for their senior choir. As his health declined, his wife, who was also a licensed funeral director and a Covington teacher, began to run the business, or took over the business. In early 1991, several months before Jack's death, the business was renamed to Delaney Garr Funeral Home, and it was primarily operated by Joseph R. Garr of Cincinnati. Jack passed away in 1991 at the Wellsprings Convalescent Center in Cincinnati. He was 79 years old. He was survived by his daughter, Claudia Abercrombie of Cincinnati, and one grandchild. Former Kenton County Judge Executive Robert Aldemeyer, who worked with Delaney for several years, spoke very fondly of Jack Delaney. Quote, "Talk about role models for young people and minority groups. He certainly was. If there was ever a problem in Covington, East End, or in that community, you could always call on John Delaney." Unquote.
Little is known about the Reverend K.C. Carl's beginnings, save for his year of birth and that he was born in the South. Reverend Carl registered for the World War I draft in September of 1918. He gave his name as Kit Carl and his date of birth as October 20th, 1877. His address at the time was 620 Russell Street, part of the neighborhood in Seminary Square that was at the time predominantly African American. He listed his wife Sarah as his closest contact. In July of 1919, he was one of 22 men injured when a commuter train carrying workmen to the Silver Grove, Chesapeake, and Ohio Railroad yards crashed. The Reverend received burns to his nose and ear and bruises to his right foot. In July 1938, he was one of a group of African American clergymen who met with a committee of Covington officials to allow African Americans to take the City of Covington's police civil service examinations. In 1939, the Reverend Carl invited Covington City Commission members to attend the laying of the cornerstone of the new Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church at 219 East 11th Street. Reverend Carl's wife Sarah died in October of 1939. She was buried in Linden Grove Cemetery in Covington. As an aside, Linden Grove Cemetery was usually the place where African Americans were buried up until the time that Mary E. Smith Cemetery was begun. In September 1941, Friends of the Macedonia Baptist Church raised over $1,100 in funds to carry on the work of the church for another year. And this was when he was pastor. When Reverend Carl registered in 1942 for what was known as the Old Men's Draft of World War II, the purpose of this registration was to collect information on the industrial capacity and skills of men who were born between April 27th of 1877 and February 16th of 1897, basically men aged 45 to 64. It was not intended that these men would be drafted into military service, but to determine if their labor skills could be used in the war effort. The registration would provide a complete inventory of manpower resources in the United States. Reverend Carl gave his date of birth as October 20th, 1879, and his place of birth as Terrell County, Georgia. He listed his address as 227 East 11th Street in Covington, and his contact was Georgia Tyler of East 9th Street. By 1945, Reverend Carl had remarried and listed his second wife, whose first name was Tressie, in the Covington City Directory. In November of 1945, he was part of the Negro Ministers Alliance of Covington, who voted unanimously to urge local African Americans to vote for the passage of the flood protection bond issue on November 6th. The bond passed overwhelmingly. Among other things, the bond paid for the building of the flood wall, which now protects the eastern neighborhoods of Covington. Reverend Carl suffered a stroke in October of 1950 and died on February 7, 1951. Dr. James Randolph was his attending physician and signed his death certificate. His wife, Tressie, died in 1971.
So this is the stone of Corporal Byron Winchester. He was born on July 9th, 1895, to William and Edith Winchester of Covington, Kentucky. He had several siblings, including Iona, Paul, William Jr., and Russell. He enlisted in the Army on July 17th, 1918, and he was honorably discharged on June 16th, 1919. He was a corporal in the company of the 801 Pioneer Infantry, which again was a unit of black soldiers. They were stationed in France starting in mid-September of 1918. According to his World War I draft card, he worked as a chauffeur for the Chevrolet Motor Car Company. By the time he filled out his World War II draft card, he was working at the Kentucky Motor Company on Scott Street in Covington. Byron married Viola Mann, a native of Carlisle, Kentucky, on August 30th of 1919, so shortly after he returned home from the war. She filed a petition for divorce in 1927, stating that the couple had been separated since November of 1919. In September of 1941, Byron, who was then 46 years old, was shot in the left leg by Jesse James, who was age 54, during an argument. That argument took place at 8th and Russell Streets in Covington. Byron suffered a compound fracture of his left leg, and he was taken to St. Elizabeth Hospital for treatment. James was charged with shooting with intent to kill. Byron died at the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Center on February 12, 1963. Byron's mother, Edith, a native of Paris, Kentucky, died on June 17, 1952, in Covington due to carcinoma of the tongue. Paul, who is Byron's brother, is also buried here, and he died in 1975.
John Arthur Washington, also known as J. Arthur or just plain Arthur, was born September 24th, 1911 in Stewart, Hale County, Alabama. He was the son of Samuel and Lizzie Jones Washington. Sam and Lizzie were married in 1907 in Hale County, Alabama, and began raising a family there. By 1930, the couple had moved to Covington with members of their family. At some point in the 1930s, Lizzie and Sam divorced. Sam was enumerated for the 1940 census while living at a hotel in Cincinnati. Sam died at his home in Cincinnati in 1961. Lizzie, who lived at 1007 Russell Street in Covington, died in 1953. Her remains were returned to Stewart, Alabama for burial. Records indicate that both Sam Washington and his son Arthur worked for the railroad, which is most likely their reason for migrating to northern Kentucky. Among his jobs listed on various records, Arthur Washington also worked as a porter at the airport. Arthur Washington died around 11:30 p.m. on October 25th, 1963, of a single gunshot wound to the chest. He was estranged from his wife at the time of his death. Records of the time, his death certificate indicated that he did die of a gunshot wound, that there had been a coroner's report filed. There was an article in the newspaper that gave a very brief description of what had happened, where it implied that a Miss Arlene Weatherspoon had gone to visit Mr. Washington, and a knock on the door was someone that she recognized the voice, her being in another room, and it turned out to be Samuel J. Buchanan, who was the father of her daughter. But when you look at the actual coroner's report, what was really happening was Mr. Washington and Miss Weatherspoon were having an affair, and Samuel Buchanan found out about it and came over and argued with Mr. Washington in the door and then shot him. When Miss Weatherspoon came out of the bedroom, she found Mr. Washington laying there mortally wounded. He was dead on arrival at St. Elizabeth Hospital. Samuel Buchanan turned himself in the next day but did not enter a plea. There was a notice in the paper that indicated Buchanan's case was postponed until November 1st, 1963. No other notice was located in the paper as to the result of his case. However, in October of 1966, 3 years after killing Mr. Washington, Samuel Buchanan was working on a road crew in Claremont County, Ohio. He was directing traffic through a construction zone when a semi-truck driven by a 21-year-old man from Illinois careened down a hill with failed brakes and struck Buchanan and head-on a car driven by Lamar and Opal Ratcliffe of Batavia. All three were killed instantly. The load of steel that the truck was carrying toppled onto the Ratcliffe car. The driver of the truck was treated for head injuries and shock. Arlene Weatherspoon Buchanan died in 1997 and was buried in Linden Grove Cemetery. Mr. Buchanan is buried not far from where Mr. Washington and his son or his father are buried.
This is Dr. Percival Lawrence Backus, who was born in 1902 in Georgetown, British Guyana. He emigrated to America in 1921, and on the passenger manifest, where he came in through New York, he gave his occupation as musician and stated he was going to visit his aunt in New Jersey. He did stay and soon afterwards advertised in the Montclair, New Jersey newspaper looking for students who wanted to learn to play the organ or the piano. Around 1926, he married an Edith Richards in New York City. Not long after that, Dr. Backus attended Howard University, where he was a member of the South America and Caribbean Club. The couple divorced sometime before 1930 when he moved to Nashville, Tennessee to attend the Meharry Medical College, a historical African American medical school. In May 1930, he married Willa M. Rucker of Nashville, Tennessee. That marriage also did not last long. In the mid-1930s, Dr. Backus moved to Newport, Kentucky, and worked with the Campbell County Health Department. He was very instrumental in helping African American children receive their vaccinations. He also maintained a private practice at 341 Central Avenue in Newport. His name did show up in the newspapers for a variety of reasons. For example, in July of 1936, Miss Fanny Ginn of Newport was charged with disorderly conduct for being abusive toward Dr. Percival when he refused to treat a cut on the hand of her sister, Miss Myrtle Ginn. Dr. Percival had explained to the sisters that he only treated African American patients. Miss Myrtle got her cut because she had fallen and broken a beer jug near her home. Dr. Backus married twice more while living in Kentucky. However, the third marriage did not work out well. In 1942, Dr. Backus was shot 3 times by his wife, Reverend. He refused to press charges, and it was not explained why she chose to shoot him. They did later divorce. Dr. Backus ran afoul of the law in the mid-1950s after performing abortions at his Central Avenue office in Newport. One of the women he performed the surgery on later died. He was tried several times, and with each case ending in a hung jury. In 1957, the Kentucky State Medical Association revoked his license. The family of the woman who had died eventually sued him for damages, and on top of that, the IRS went after him for back taxes. I believe that the stress of it finally was too much for him, and he died in 1962. I also wanted to note that his son Percival Jr., who was born in 1953, served in the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, and he died in Cincinnati in 2010.